Hey guys, in today's video I want to go over the elemental system in DragonHeir Silent Gods. Very simply, there are 6 major elements, but they are paired into groups of 2. For example, fire and poison are paired ice and necrotic, and then lightning and radiant are paired. The best way that you can see this is by going into combat, and during the deployment phase in the top left you can click this symbol here to enter the alignment overview, and you can see the pairings here: lightning and radiant, fire and poison, and ice and necrotic. There are 3 and 5 piece bonuses if you have heroes from these factions. So if you have 3 to 5 ice and necrotic heroes in your team of 5 heroes, then you will gain these bonuses. The bonuses are the same for each alignment pairing. It's either 20% attack and defense or 15% of the elemental damage for the 2 element types. A lot of heroes do element damage in this game, so I'm pretty sure the 5-step bonus will scale quite high, because obviously there's a coefficient between how the attack scales and how the element damage scales. I believe the 5-step bonus will be very powerful in that way. So for the contents of this video, I'm going to be going over each of these elements individually, looking at what makes that element unique, some synergy between its heroes, as well as some of the subtypes per element. So for example, you can see fire has wild, you can see frost on ice heroes, and summon on necrotic heroes. We're going to go into that throughout the video, and I will be showing gameplay clips throughout to show you what I mean and to show some of the hero skills to make it a bit clearer as to how they work. So with that, let's get started. So returning to look at the heroes, you may want to know what the differences are between the actual elements themselves. One of the most important things I've seen so far is when you look at the heroes in the name, in square brackets, they sometimes have another key word. For example, some fire element heroes will have wild. And you can also notice that some other fire element heroes have burn. These are the kind of 2 subclasses or subtypes of fire element heroes, wild and burn. And if you take a look at a wild hero, and you have a look at some of their traits, you can see sometimes this will pop up on one of the skills. Wild performs a check upon a casted skill with a basic success rate of 30%. When you pass, deals 120% damage and healing effect. And if you fail, it deals 95% damage and healing effect. So you can see here on this skill there is this coloured keyword wild in the skill description. This means that when you cast this ability, there will be a check that's made passively behind the scenes, and you have a 30% chance of succeeding. Upon success, the damage will be increased by 20%, or the healing will be increased by 20% if it's a healing ability, and if you fail the check, you will lose 5% damage on that ability or 5% healing. So that's kind of how the wild system works in absolute brief. We'll go into a bit more detail in just a second, but first let's go over to the burn effect. So again, you can see abilities that apply the burn effect have another marker over here explaining what the burn effect does. Deals area damage every 6 seconds up to 10 stacks. And you can see the ability itself says with a 100% chance of inflicting 3 stacks of burn status for 6 seconds. I've noticed that pretty much any of the debuffs in this game will specify status, because there are things that will apply burn damage or poison damage, and then other places it will specify poison status. So that seems to be the keywords they're using to differentiate between just doing damage and actually applying a debuff. So for now we're going to focus on the fire element, but we will go through all of them in this video, so it's going to be a fairly long video, but hopefully it's informative. So let's have a look at the wild a little bit more. Here are all of the current fire heroes in the game. There will be more coming fairly soon, but right now these are the ones that are in the game, and I've been looking over them, and you can see Errich here. He is the hero up for grabs with 5 million pre-registers, and if you look at his passive ability, it increases the hero's wild success rate by 10% every time an ally launches a successful wild, stacking up to 8 times. And as a second part, whenever the hero launches a successful wild, the skill deals damage twice. So from the second part alone, you can assume that Errich, upon doing one of his abilities, such as his Pillar of Flame battle skill, which isn't a normal, I think it's just one of his standardized skills which has a cooldown, when he succeeds the wild check on this skill, the damage is dealt twice. So this is one of the special effects of Errich. His wild effects not only do bonus damage, but they also trigger damage twice. So very, very powerful. And of course, like all other fire element heroes, his base wild success rate is 30%, but every time an ally succeeds wild, it goes up by 10%. So you can see there's a lot of synergy here between Errich and other fire wild heroes. So what I want to focus on in this video are the different elements and the different subtypes for those elements, as well as possible synergies, because this is kind of where I think the basis for most theory crafting begins. So you can see Errich massively synergizes with other fire wild heroes. Then we'll have a look at Flora next, another legendary fire hero who is also wild. You don't see wild in the brackets here for some reason in this view, but she is also a wild hero. And you can see here, if you go to her passive, Every time an ally successfully enters wild, the familiar will automatically unleash its battle skill on the current ally's target once. So you can see here, Flaming Sphere, the familiar unleashes 2 fireballs at the enemy, dealing fire damage. So whenever an ally successfully passes their wild check, Flora's familiar will fire 2 fireballs at that ally's target. So very powerful synergy there just between these two heroes. I've been using them a lot together when I've been playing and testing things out. They seem to be a very potent pairing for sure. Now there are a bunch of other heroes here who have interactions with wild, but we're not going to go over them because they aren't synergistic. They don't interact with other people's wilds other than these two who will trigger based on other people's wilds. The other heroes in the game who have wild effects such as these do not impact other heroes. So they're obviously very strong, but they're not really relevant to what I want to go over now, which is synergy between heroes. So from the wild side of things, Errich and Flora seem to be the most important ones since they synergize with other wild heroes. Now having a look at Burn, the legendary Asatius seems to be very specialized in Burn. Even in his passive skill, you can see that when a basic attack deals damage to enemies under the Burn status, the hero's recharge time will be reduced by 5%. So recharge time is for his ultimate. I believe it will make his ultimate recover faster. And then if we look at his ultimate, we can see that it dispels all enemies' burn status, and then he crashes into the ground, dealing fire damage to all enemies, and he deals fire damage to targets and nearby enemies with their burn status dispelled by this skill. So the wording's a bit iffy to me, but it sounds like he does more damage to enemies who have burn on them. So obviously you're going to want to pair him with people who are stacking burn everywhere you can. Next we have the epic Lille. You can see that his passive grants him an attack up based on the number of enemies under burn status. So I think this goes up to 3, I could be wrong, so I'm guessing if there are 3 enemies in burn status, he'll get attack up 3, which is quite a significant attack boost. And his ultimate fire booster deals damage to enemies within range, and if the enemies are inflicted by burn, it will trigger an additional burn effect, so the burn will stack on them effectively. And as you remember, burn deals area damage every 6 seconds up to 10 stacks, so this is a great way of increasing stacks on enemies who are already burning. And finally, for the fire faction, we have Araces, I think, Araces. And in terms of synergy, his ultimate grants him an attack up boost, deals fire damage to enemies within range, and then if the enemies are under a burn status, so they have a burning debuff on them, it deals additional fire damage to them for each stack of burn status. So even though he's a rare, I think he probably has potential to be quite strong, since this is AoE damage and it scales based on the number of burn stacks on the enemy, so I think he could be pretty good for early game burn teams. Now there are a bunch of other heroes here that apply burn and have their own wild interactions, but I thought it would be good to focus on the ones that interact with each other's effects, so you can kind of see which heroes are key to building synergistic teams. So from the fire side of things, it seems to be mainly Asatius, Lille and Araces seem to have good scaling with each other, and from the wild side of things, Errich and Flora seem to be the most important. I think this is definitely a very powerful team using these two together, and probably building them with more wild heroes. I haven't tried that too much myself, but I will be soon. So we'll move on to poison next, since it seems to be an element paired with fire. So first let's look at what poison is as a debuff. You can see up here, poison, each stack deals poison damage equal to 0.1% of the target's max HP every 2 seconds up to 10 stacks. So that will be 1% of the target's max HP every 2 seconds, or 0.5% a second. Bosses do get very tanky in this game, so I can see poison being very, very powerful later on when you can reliably get to 10 stacks and keep it up for a long time. So first up, from the poison side of things, Rosselle. He is a legendary poison-focused hero. Passively, when a skill deals damage to enemies inflicted with poison status, it deals additional poison damage, and it says the damage bonus is target's max HP. So I'm not sure of the scaling. It would be cool if they told us, but it sounds like it deals damage scaling on the enemy's max HP, which would be pretty insane, especially since the prerequisite to trigger this is simply having any poison status on the enemies. It doesn't specify the number of stacks or anything. So that should be very, very strong. He does, of course, also have a bunch of ways of applying poison himself. The poison faction only seems to have one effect that it focuses on, which is, of course, poison. It doesn't have multiple like the fire faction does with wild and burn. Not all factions have 2, some do, some don't. There are also some buffs and debuffs that seem to be currently specific to certain factions. I'm not sure if that's going to be the same going forward or just for the time being. So Jathalea, another poison hero, legendary. Her ultimate Determination deals poison damage to enemies within the targeted range, and if the enemies are inflicted with poison status, each stack of poison status increases poison damage. And again, you can see the damage bonus attack target's max HP. So it seems like the poison bonus damage effects scale on the target's max HP. I think you definitely want to be building teams for these kind of things. So you want to have a poison team, a burn team, a wild team. That's kind of how I'm seeing things developing. Next up, we have Colin. And if you take a look at his passive, when an enemy under poison status dies, it spreads its poison status to nearby enemies and deals poison damage to them. but this time you can see the damage bonus is attack. It's not actually percentage of max HP. Additionally, for Colin, if we take a look at his ultimate, it refreshes the duration of one enemy's poison, spreads its poison status to nearby enemies, and deals poison damage. And again, poison damage seems to be on attack, not on max HP. But that is a very powerful ability to have, since it is a pretty large area. I'm not sure what it says by nearby, if that means exactly adjacent or within a few tiles. We'll take some testing to figure that out. But being able to spread all the stacks across targets would be very powerful, especially since a hero like Rosselle seems to focus on applying a bunch of stacks to a single target. From the rare side of things, we have Lollari. He has a passive that when the skill deals damage to poisoned enemies, it has a chance of inflicting a defense penalty status on the enemies. So you definitely want to use him with poisoners, and we can assume he also applies poison himself. Pretty minor synergy, but it's just interesting to look at what does happen in the game. And lastly, from poison, we have Eli, and if you take a look at his passive, when dealing damage to enemies inflicted with poison status, deals additional poison damage, which is a bonus scaling on attack again. So pretty simple, but again, you just want to pair these with poisoners. It's just more of a signal that you really want to be building teams for specific purposes. I don't think you really want to be throwing in random groups of heroes. It definitely seems that you want to build towards certain types of damage, and definitely for certain types of content. I am planning to make videos going over the different dungeons and different team comps that you'll want for the dungeons, but for now I'm still doing a lot of research on the heroes. I think it's a good way to get a foundation in the game and to understand what you're looking at going forward. So next up, we'll have a look at Ice. There are two main debuffs for the Ice faction. They are Frost and Frozen. However, as you can see here with Hivta, there is a Frost in the square brackets, but I haven't seen it be anything other than Frost or nothing. I haven't seen Frozen applied there, so it just seems to be Frozen is a stronger debuff that some heroes apply, but not all of them. So first off, what is Frost? Frost reduces movement speed by 10%. A pretty simple effect for sure. There'll be synergy with other heroes who benefit from attacking Frost slowed enemies, but also there are areas in the game where slowing enemies can be potentially beneficial. And if we look at Varna here, another legendary, she has a passive that allows her to apply the Frozen status to enemies attempting to control her, so stun her, or other types of impairing debuffs. And you can see here the Frozen debuff prevents the target from launching basic attacks or casting skills, but it does reduce the damage they take. So that's a very powerful way of dealing with ads to buy yourself time. It seems to be a very strong controlling debuff. Of course, almost everyone in this faction is going to be doing lots of ice damage with their attacks, but again, I just want to have a look specifically at the ones that have some synergy with these core debuffs from the faction. So Vidimir is an epic from the faction. He has a passive that when he deals damage to enemies inflicted with Frost status, he deals additional ice damage, which is a damage bonus scaling on attack. You will see this quite a lot with certain heroes. They just do an additional amount of damage when attacking an enemy that has the correlating debuff to their faction. So nothing particularly special or unusual there, it's just good to see what's around. And there's the rare Wusa, who has two different effects that have synergy in her passive and in her ultimate. In her passive, this is kind of a strangely worded one. For every 2 basic attacks the hero deals to the enemy under Frost status, the next basic attack will have a 100% chance to apply a defense penalty 2, which is a 60% reduction in defense, which is quite big. So basically every third attack against an enemy that has Frost on them will apply a defense break on them. So that seems pretty strong to me. That seems like a very reliable way of applying a very strong defense break. And secondly, her ultimate Icebreaker Slash deals AoE damage in a burst, applying Frost, and I believe if the enemy already had Frost, then the skill deals double damage to the enemies. So pretty strong, and again the damage is scaling on attack. Almost all of them will be, but it's good to see how it scales. From this, I think Wusa is probably a pretty strong hero to use. Lots of these guys are applying Frost in their abilities. Anyway, that's pretty much it for the Ice faction. They seem to focus primarily on Frost debuff and Frozen debuff to slow enemies as well as CC them and hard control them. So Necrotic is paired with Ice in regards to the alignment system, so we'll have a look at them next. And the special effect of the Necrotic element heroes are that they are mainly summoners, or they have summoners rather. So you can see certain heroes such as Charlesen summon a creature at a location that deals damage on their behalf. These are very powerful, and you can definitely see summon teams becoming very dominant in this game. So if you're used to other idle games, summon teams to me so far seem to be primarily from the Necrotic faction. There are a bunch of different heroes who have the summons. Charlesen is probably the strongest one that I'm aware of. Georil has summons himself. He can grant extra summons to allies like basic skeletons, and he has incredible synergy by duplicating an ally's summon. Zadok has skeleton summons that he brings up. Ishtarian has a summon that spawns at the beginning of battle. There are just loads of different summon mechanics between all these heroes. and a lot of them have synergy. So let's have a look at some of the synergy that already exists for the necrotic element. So primarily I think Georil is probably going to be one of the most important heroes for this faction. Even just his passive, allies summon undead creatures that deals necrosis damage to nearby enemies within 5 seconds. The wording for this is a bit unusual to me, but it sounds like allies summons will do AoE damage around them, is how I read that, which would be very potent, as you would assume that they could overlap and you could have lots of damage coming out if you had lots of summons. But mainly the reason I'm interested in Georil is his ultimate, Double Taboo. Enhances a designated ally undead creature, so a summon, granting it an attack up 50% attack bonus for 10 seconds and duplicates it. And duplication, you can see, summons a duplicate of a designated ally undead creature. So I've used Georil in combination with Sharlasen to duplicate the Abyssal Domination, the Fear Bearer, and it is very powerful. I've had a lot of success with that, and I think Sharlasen is probably one of the strongest DPS in the game. So having someone buff and duplicate his summon is very, very powerful. So I think there's definitely two of the ideal dream team if you want to build a summon team. Next, there is Zadok. He is an epic hero in the necrotic faction, and you can see his passive, every time a friendly summoned unit dies, reduces the hero's recharge time by 10% and permanently increases its attack, stacking up to 20 times. It doesn't say how much it increases the attack by, but should be pretty good. And there are certain heroes, such as Georil, who are spawning skeletons quite fast, and even Zadok himself spawns skeletons which die quite quickly, so you'd expect him to be gaining stacks of this himself pretty fast. And finally, in terms of synergistic heroes for the necrotic faction, there is Korth, and his passive, when allies summon undead creatures, grant the summoned units an attack up status for 10 seconds. This is attack up 1 because I haven't ranked him up to 2 stars. When you do, it becomes attack up 2. So pretty good bonus there. It's only for 10 seconds, but it's still quite nice. And for his ultimate, throws a potion that grants attack speed up 2 to all allied undead creatures within range for 10 seconds. So that's a 50% attack speed boost for 10 seconds. Pretty strong. You could imagine pairing him with the Sharlasen Georil combo to have insane fear bearers going crazy breaking stuff. And considering he's only a rare, it's probably not a very expensive investment either. Okay, so we are left with Lightning and Radiant for our final pair from the alignment table. So we'll start with Lightning. The main aspect of the Lightning faction is the Dauntless buff. So if we take a look at a hero with the Dauntless effect, you can see Dauntless in the top right here. Allies' basic attacks may trigger the special effects of skills. So basically what this means is that some heroes of the lightning element will have skills which will have bonus effects that will have a chance to trigger on basic attacks. That means you're going to have a lot of multi-attacking heroes, a lot of heroes with high attack speed, and you're going to have a lot of attack speed boosts inside this element as well, since obviously that all plays into basic attacks. There is no second subtype for the lightning element, there's just Dauntless, but for the purpose of talking about elemental synergy, I think Dauntless is the main one for the lightning element. So first off we have Ivellios, and he has a passive. When an ally launches a basic attack, the hero, which I believe means Ivellios, has a 15% chance of launching an additional attack to the ally's target, dealing lightning damage, scaling on attack. Simply, whenever an ally makes a basic attack, or an attack that counts as a basic attack, Ivellios has a 15% chance to launch his own attack at that ally's target for lightning damage. You can see there is also a skill up system, so when these skills level up, these chances and these rates can increase, so definitely keep that in mind. Next up we have Sutha. The passive and both abilities for Sutha have some kind of relation to the Dauntless effect. When dealing critical damage, it creates a phantom. The phantom then launches a follow-up attack dealing lightning damage, scaling on attack. The follow-up attack is counted as a basic attack. So basically whenever Sutha crits, there is another instance of damage dealt by a phantom, and that counts as a basic attack. So if you were to have Ivellios in the party, then if you have a 100% crit rate on Sutha, every single attack is basically a multi-attack. So you have twice the chance of proccing Priest Splendor from Ivellios, which is pretty strong. It's good synergy there. Next up we have the battle skill for Sutha. Launches a double slash to the enemy to deal lightning damage twice, with a 100% chance to inflict defense penalty 2 for 5 seconds, and this skill is considered a basic attack and has an additional 30% chance to deal critical damage. So this is a double attack that counts as basic attack, so that's 2 attacks. It has an increased chance of dealing critical damage as well, so that stacks with her passive, so there's a lot of chance of dealing bonus attacks from the Phantom. So that's a lot of basic attacks coming out from Sutha there, just in those 2 things, her battle skill and her passive. And for her ultimate, Mighty Mutilation, she charges the enemy with an axe, swings at it 5 times, each one doing lightning damage, with a knock-up effect on the final hit, and this skill is considered a basic attack and has an additional 30% chance to deal critical damage, and it has a revive block. The attack does 5 instances of damage that count as basic attacks, so lots of attacks coming out there. Again, good chance of crit rate, high chances of proccing basic attacks. You would think Sutha and Ivellios probably have pretty good synergy, with Sutha just raining attacks out rapidly, all of them counting as basic attacks with increased crit rates, proc this passive more often to get more of those follow-up lightning damage procs. So a lot of lightning damage done by Sutha and a lot of basic attacks, which will be triggering Ivellios. Saggero's passive, basic attacks have a 50% chance to attack twice, and there's obviously skill ups in here increasing that by quite a lot, so that's obviously very nice, lots of multi-attacks. And then on his ultimate, he leaps at the target enemy, slashing 5 times, and each slash is considered a basic attack that deals lightning damage. So lots of attacks flying in there, all of them counting as basic attack. Next up we have Schatt. His ultimate Thunder's Gift enhances all allies with lightning force, granting them Thunder's Gift, which grants their basic attacks a chance to deal bonus lightning damage. So that's obviously going to scale very well with a lot of these characters, since most of their attacks seem to count as basic attacks. And the second half of Thunder's Gift, over the duration of the buff, when all allies launch basic attacks, they have a 50% chance of summoning a lightning strike on enemies, dealing lightning damage. And next up we have the rare Agnes. Agnes's ultimate, Frenzied Slayer, hurls 3 javelins, each dealing lightning damage to the target, and the skill is considered a basic attack. So that's pretty simple. That seems to be the gist of the ones that I've found that seem to have synergy between them in terms of Dauntless effects. Ivellios definitely seems to be one of the better ones to have, since he will scale off of his allies' Dauntless procs. And Schatt seems to be very powerful as well, considering he offers bonus lightning damage on allies' basic attacks, so you can see Schatt being very good with Sutha as well. The other 2 legendaries on his faction, Zemfira and Grishnar, do have very powerful skill sets, though from what I've looked at, they don't seem to have synergy with the other heroes regarding Dauntless buffs. So I imagine these are heroes you can place in most teams. If you're not running a 5 alignment team, if you're running a 3 alignment team, then I think these are the kind of heroes that you'll probably put in your 4th and your 5th slots. As someone like Zemfira, for example, has a battle skill that will periodically dispel buffs from enemies. Stuff like that I can imagine you using for 4th and 5th slots if you're not running the 5-set bonus. But in terms of the lightning faction, specifically for the Dauntless buff, I think Ivellios is probably the most important. Sutha is obviously very powerful as well, probably where a lot of the damage comes from, I would assume, and Schatt seems to be a very good support for the bonus thunder damage, as well as the chance for extra lightning strikes, which is just really strong. So that about covers the lightning faction. Now last off we have the Radiant faction, which is the second half of that alignment pairing. So we'll start with Lorentheel. What we're going to be looking at is the Rally buff. Some skills are enhanced when the hero releases them with Rally. So Rally is effectively a state or a buff that a hero can be in, and when they have this effect, some of their skills will be enhanced. So first let's take a look at Lorentheel and see what he can do. So passive skill, when the hero is fully recharged, grants rally status to all allies for 10 seconds. So fully recharged, I'm assuming, is the ultimate, and the rally status for 10 seconds to all allies is pretty good. So there's immediate lineup and synergy. Whenever Lorentheel is ready to go, everyone else is as well. Lorentheel's battle skill also has pretty good synergy, but you have to look at this part unlocks at rank 2, which is pretty easy to do. I haven't upgraded all the heroes yet, but this isn't a big deal. When an ally is rally casting spells, this skill becomes castable immediately. So this skill is an AoE burst of radiance damage, and it applies defense penalty 2. So a pretty important debuff to be applying, nice AoE damage as well. And whenever an ally rally casts a spell, this becomes immediately castable, which is really nice. So you can imagine having Lorentheel in a team full of rallying heroes. Lorentheel will be able to blast Forest Wind Assault rapidly and maintain defense break on a lot of enemies. Now have a look at Lorentheel's ultimate. Unleashes a domain. When allies are rally casting spells within the domain, reduces their recharge time by 20%, so they get their spells back faster. And you can see here in the color text, casting rally. This means that when you have the rally buff effect on you and you cast this skill, you gain this extra bonus. Not all skills have this, only certain ones. This is the only skill that Lorentheel has that gains a bonus from rally. Grants crit rate up status to all allies for 10 seconds, which grants 30% crit rate. So whenever Lorentheel ults while having rally, all allies will gain 30% crit rate for 10 seconds, which is really nice as well. Next up, we'll look at Huberg, another legendary from the Radiant element. His passive, Leader's Prestige, when allies are rally casting spells, gains rally status and attack up to status for 10 seconds. So you can see there's a bit of synergy between these two already. Whenever Huberg gains rally and uses a rally cast, then Lorentheel will regain the Forest Wind Assault battle skill. So there's going to be a lot of play between them. It sounds like the Radiant faction will focus on kind of just chaining skills off of one another. You can also see Huberg has the battle skill Watcher's Smite, fires holy light orbs at the enemies, explode on hit, dealing radiance damage to enemies within range, and the hero has a 40% chance to gain rally status for 5 seconds. So already 2 good ways of gaining rally on this hero. And then for an ultimate, summon 3 arcane energy orbs from above to strike enemies within range, with each orb dealing radiance damage. Each time this spell is cast, an additional 1 energy orbs are summoned, up to 7 orbs. casting Rally, the spell will be cast 1 additional time. So as you can see, having Rally on Huberg and casting his ultimate, you will be double casting his ultimate. So you absolutely want to cast his ultimate while having Rally in effect, which may mean this faction is quite important to manual over autoing, I would assume. It might be a little bit less reliable unless you've really tuned your team, but I think that tends to be quite hard in idle games. So it may be interesting to see how well Radiant teams play, because you do definitely want to take advantage of the Rally casting. Next up, we'll have a look at Martina. Martina's passive, Cheerful Aura. When gaining Rally status, the hero's recharge time will be reduced by 20%. And you can see over here, reduced recharge time increases the recharging speed of ultimate skills. So that's really, really good. It just grants allies a faster recovery on their ultimates. Her battle skill, Sunburst Attack, deals radiance damage to surrounding enemies. You can see up here the grid. A critical hit is guaranteed if 2 or more enemies are hit, and the hero gains Rally status for 10 seconds. So long as Martina is able to hit 2 or more enemies with her battle skill, she will gain Rally for 10 seconds, so that's quite a nice way of getting hold of it. And that will of course reduce the recharge time on her ultimate by 20% from her passive here, so that's nice synergy. And then if we look at her ultimate, there is a casting Rally effect. By default, it deals radiant damage to enemies within range, so you can see up here. And then when casting under the Rally effect, the skill has a guaranteed critical hit, with a 100% chance to inflict vulnerability status for 10 seconds, vulnerability increasing the damage the enemy takes by 30%. The last 2 heroes of this faction to talk about are Wellby and Muliere, so we'll have a look at Wellby first. His passive, Harmony Brings Wealth. When gaining Rally status, grants attack up 1 to surrounding allies for 5 seconds, so just an easy stat boost. They do need to be around him though, so it wouldn't be very good for certain melee heroes, but as you can see, quite a few of these characters are probably ranged, though I would assume Asatius and Martina are not. And then secondly, we have Wellby's ultimate, Payment on Delivery. Deals radiance damage to enemies within range with a 50% chance to inflict vulnerability status for 10 seconds, and if you cast this while under the effect of Rally, after casting the skill, the hero's recharge time will be reduced by 50%, which is a massive reduction in charging the ultimate, so it will just allow him to kind of keep firing it. Wellby is only a rare, so this seems to be like a very light version of Huberg's ultimate Rally where he casts it in additional time. This just allows him to recharge a lot faster to get his ultimate up again. And last we have Muliere. When gaining Rally status, the hero gains attack up 2 status for 10 seconds, so it's only for him. And if you have a look at his ultimate, Ring of Faith, unleashes Ring Slash, dealing radiance damage to nearby enemies with a 75% chance of inflicting defense penalty 1 status for 10 seconds. Casting under Rally deals additional radiant damage. So very simply, he just gains bonus damage on his ultimate when casting under Rally, and as a passive he gains attack up when he gains Rally as well. But you may have noticed that Wellby and Muliere don't have a way of actually gaining Rally for themselves from what I can see. So from a quick glance, it seems that Lorentheel and Huberg are the only heroes currently in the Radiant element that can grant or gain Rally by themselves. I think the other characters are kind of dependent on having one of these two to really make it work. So that's quite interesting. There are going to be a load of heroes added to the game, but maybe the Radiant team, if you want to run a Rally comp, is quite restricted. I think Lorentheel is probably going to be the most important one to get. So that about covers it for the alignments and the synergy between the elements, as well as their specialized kind of subtypes for each element. As you can see, there's definitely a dominant hero in each element. If you want to run an element only comp, I think it will probably be where the strongest teams are at. So for the fire team, Flora and Errich seem to be incredibly potent as a duo for having a wild team. If you want a burn team, Asatius seems to be quite important, though I think the burn team is a little bit easier to run as it's a bit less dependent on having Errich. The Ice faction's Frost and Frozen debuffs don't seem to be anywhere near as difficult to build a team around, since they're kind of just slowing passives and some control, and you gain a bit of damage from it, but it's nothing heavy, so I think it's probably an easier faction to work with that isn't as reliant on pivotal heroes. The Necrotic faction seems to focus entirely on summons. I think Georil is the best supporting hero for this element, with Charlesen being the best DPS for it. Some of the other heroes are very good. I know that Belenga is a very good tank, but I don't think he specifically needs to have a Necrotic team built around him to serve that purpose, but you can definitely see that certain heroes really do want a team built around them. From Radiant, it definitely seems like Lorentheel is the linchpin that pulls it all together if you want to run a Rally build. As for Lightning, I think Ivellios is probably the most important, though I think Sutha will be very strong as well. One thing to note with the Lightning element is that a bunch of the heroes do boost other things outside of being in direct relation to Dauntless. For example, quite a lot of them offer attack speed up buffs. So I think the Lightning team might be a bit easier to get early game synergy with. I don't think you're dependent on having a particular legendary to tie it all together. I think it just really shines more when you have someone like Ivellios or Sutha to really stack the damage up from. As for the Poison faction, the only prerequisite seems to be maintaining 10 stacks as long as you can, and this definitely seems to only be useful in bosses because the percentage is quite low. Rosselle seems to be the most dangerous poison hero from the looks of things, mainly because his attack scale on the target's max HP. Most other poisoners seem to scale just on attack, as you can see here. However, I think Jathalea is probably one of the more important heroes, since her ultimate deals damage based on the number of poison status stacks on a given enemy. So that's a very quick overview. As I said, there are definitely more buffs and effects that seem to be unique to each faction. For example, I noticed that the Necrotic faction applies invisibility quite a lot, and that the Radiant faction applies a lot of reduced recharge time to allies, as well as increased recharge time to enemies. But yeah, for the purpose of this video, I mainly wanted to talk about elements and the alignment system, and to put some ideas out there on the most important heroes for synergy, and to give you some ideas on what heroes you may want if you want to build towards certain teams. So far it seems pretty promising. I'm going to be playing around with these different team comps in the coming days, so do subscribe if you're interested in seeing some more technical details of the combat system. Thank you guys very much for watching. Let me know if you have any thoughts, ideas, or things you want to see. Have a great week, take care, and bye bye.